Hi there, and welcome to this Made Sense video in which I want to talk about the phenomenology. What I want to do here is sort of focus on a way to think about actually simplifying it. So in part one, I showed you just how complex the phenomenology is. It kind of which sort of shows you, why we get caught up in the story of it. Of course, which gives you some indication of why we have so many different experiences of interacting with it and interpretations of what it is and of course what it means for us. So is there a way to simplify this complexity that helps us make sense of it? So what I want to do here is actually focus on simplifying it around the idea of one question. So for me, the interesting thing about it is that voices introduce all this information, and it is our reaction and response to this information that produces the extreme states. So why don't we just ignore it? So if we ask the question, what are the things that contribute to making it so difficult to ignore, that gives us one way to sort of theme the characteristics of the phenomenology that make it very, very difficult to ignore. So that's what this video is about. So I'm going to kick off with just one slide summarizing the phenomenology part one video, just to kind of give you an idea of the complexity and why it creates so much confusion, just a reminder. And then I'm going to take two slides on, that take a stab at simplifying it based on asking this question, what makes it impossible to ignore? And I'm going to look at two sides of the equation. How does the phenomenology cause the brain to adjust and adapt and become hypervigilant, which, if you like, readies the brain to receive content in a particular way? And then what are the characteristics of the phenomenology that get our attention, hold our attention, and bring information into focus? And then in summarizing it, I will actually just get back to the stories and say, why the stories are so important, because that's actually what we engage with. It's how we engage with life. So first of all, just a quick reminder of the complexity. And for me, my experience of this is that actually it adds layers of confusion. And of course, because I'm experiencing voices as something that is external to me, that is connecting to me, via some unusual connection between myself and this phenomenon. We always say this kind of thing, Greggy boy, you can't swear on the web. This is voices asserting that there is something that connects them to us and each of us to each other. And of course, because they sit in this space of this web that connects us, that's what they use to claim from their ability to observe. They then escalate that to claims of influence and power, of course, over us. So all of this language then, of course, just sort of contributes to the confusion because it directs us towards interpreting it and assessing the implications of it. And of course, that's the story that we talk about. What I want to do is push this much further back to the origin of the stimulus and say, what characteristics do these stimuli have that, as I say, get the attention of both the brain and the mind? So first of all, the complexity. This is just a summary of a few bits from the phenomenology part one video, in which I spoke about 4 types of phenomenology. Sort of, I described auditory, this number 1 up here, where we're hearing, say, sounds at a distance, which provoke questions in a particular way. I then spoke about, well, what happens when you actually hear people talking to each other? Of course, what you then do is you add characters. You automatically, we associate voices with people. So, of course, we start to form beliefs about, about who those people are. And of course, I described that this is still kind of one way. So I'm hearing something over there at a distance. And then the third one I spoke about was the moment voices started talking about me. Of course, it became much, much more personal. And simply by making the topic, me, that of course provoked a whole host of new questions. And then, as I mentioned in my first episode videos, somewhere in the first several weeks, my phenomenology, progressed to what we call a thought echo, which is a much, much more invasive thing, where somehow the interaction with these voices raises your thoughts audibly to this kind of sense of them being broadcast in the same space or in the same bandwidth that you hear voices, so that my own thoughts and what voices say are heard. I hear them both audibly in the same kind of space, and we actually now, each thought I have is part of an interaction, and my thoughts themselves now have implications. So that's the degrees, if you like, of invasiveness of these sort of 4 types that I spoke about. And of course, what happens, as I say, the way I'm describing these is that these 2 over here, 1 and 2, were kind of one-way things. So I'm experiencing it's almost like a sensory input, so it's coming in my direction. What changed the game emotionally was when it became personal. Then of course what changed the game significantly when it went to the thought echo was that this now became 2-way. And of course, you then, because it's interacting with your thoughts and kind of telling you, what you can and can't do, you experience it as very much in the way. And of course, in this mode, for want of another description, voices, of course, became much more assertive. And what you want to think about here is, where am I placing the implications of this interaction? So that's the context in which we experience it. Our mind is predictive. So how am I flowing that information forwards? How am I predicting it? How am I projecting it? Because that's where I'm assessing implications. And of course, it's the implications that are, in effect, the emotional experience of it. And I'll summarize this slightly differently on another slide, where I'm just going to pick 3 of those 4. So what happens, of course, is here we're asking questions, and this is actually one way to think about theming the phenomenology, because it is whilst we might reach lots of different answers, the questions we ask are actually quite predictable. When we first start to hear this thing, of course, we ask what it is. If it's a voice, of people talking to each other, of course, what becomes who. When it starts to talk about me, of course, it gets personal, and I start to say, well, why the bleep is this happening, and why the bleep is it happening to me? So I ask those questions. One, about this other entity. Why would this entity be doing this to me? And then, of course, why me? Why me, and not not someone else? Basically, there must be something about me which puts me in the middle. And then, of course, what's unusual about all of these, of course, is that they're different. These are stimuli that appear in the aware mind in a way that's quite different than our ordinary stimuli. So, of course, this is why when we start to ask these, well, how the bleep is this happening questions? And of course, this is where the ideas of a web or a hub or something that connects us to something other, which may or may not have implications for other people, of course, is a question we ask. And because it's unusual, we're inclined, and we are predictive, we're inclined to think it must have implications. And of course, that's just simply how the mode, if you like, of interaction is provoking the mind. But then, just to pick one example, of course, is that I mentioned in the phenomenology part that one of the things that voices did was played this game of being mischievous fairies, and they did that by being many voices making lots of noise. I say almost like sticking my head in a beehive, and of course making these sort of comments that you can't sleep. And so I started to call it, there were lots of varieties of this kind of thing. And of course, I started to call them displays of phenomenology, because voices were just using phenomenology to create a story. So I didn't actually believe that these things were fairies, but of course, that was the story that they imposed on me that then became part of the game. That they sort of played with me for a while. So I call this kind of phenomenology theatrical. For me, the plot was about voices trying to create confusion by introducing ideas about many more beliefs, and by demonstrating power in the sense that they were imposing this phenomenology on me. And of course, the real effect of it was that this was happening typically when I was in bed and trying to go to sleep. And this, of course, was when I didn't want to be pushing back against voices and saying, I'm not interested, or this is not relevant. They made it relevant simply by asserting a presence while I was trying to go to sleep. And of course, the effect of that was to disrupt sleep. And of course, the characters they introduced were, of course, fairies, which I say didn't really mean anything to me, but of course, it's just the kind of thing we easily, of course, attach meaning to. And then I used the example where, taking essentially the same picture, I'm saying, voices then started to assert who and what they were. And of course, they introduced the idea of ancestors, first of all, to set the scene of, of an afterlife. And of course, and then by claiming to be, God and then the devil. And then later on, just a big man, they were introducing characters, that had specific representation in cultural contexts, where some people would believe in them, of course, and others not. And of course, culturally, people perceive this character as good. And this is his I don't know, alter ego buddy, I'm not quite sure. But of course, what was happening with voices are just playing all of these roles, of course, to insert conflict. And of course, this, as I say, is also something that is very, very theatrical. The plot for me was introducing sort of conflict between good versus evil. The kind of scene that they set was now a cosmic opera, some kind of afterlife with an influence on this life, or vice versa. What I do in this life has an influence on what happens in the other life. Voices do like to play both angles from that sort of thing. And of course, the set became my life. Everything I did, in fact, everything I thought became significant. Of course, particularly because voices, went as far as declaring me to be the second coming, and just persisted with the idea over a couple of years, so whether I agreed or not. And of course, they introduced these characters, sort of God the devil, just to make it, a whole lot more scary. So, and you can see a bit more about, how voices, use this kind of process, if you like, the sort of mode, this unusualness, the how, the hub, the idea of this network between us, and extending it to this sort of cosmic opera. This is what they try, plus then inserting these particular characters that have some sort of cultural context. And of course, this is how they try to escalate their power, of one sort of from observing me to knowing, to being able to influence, to having omnipotence. So they just kind of escalated that experience of it, of just observing to omnipotence. So, this presents a few ways to actually think about theming the phenomenology. One of them is actually the questions we ask, and I will do this to some extent in another phenomenology video. Another one is about the beliefs that we form about what this phenomenology is. Another one is about the kind of relationship that we form between ourselves and voices, of course, which has, both of these have implications for shaping relationships, of course, with ourselves. And then the other one, and you've seen this or you can see this in one of the experience videos, is that these stories have particular characteristics. So we can actually sort of theme this stuff, this stuff by stories. And I say, I will actually do all of these, but what I want to do in this one is say, there's yet another way, and that's to say, to ask the question, well, this stuff, as I say, is very confusing. There's some ways to simplify. Is there another way to try and kind of make sense of it? And of course, the question I'm asking is, why can't we ignore it? What makes it so difficult to ignore? So clearly, from this kind of slide, voices couldn't be my neighbors, which is my first interpretation, and fairies, and God, and the devil, and just a big man, and all of these kinds of things. So of course, where voices are presenting all the evidence, of course, what you're doing is trying to dismiss it, but of course, voices just persist. And of course, that's one of the things that actually makes it very, very difficult to ignore voices. And really what's happening is that our brain is adjusting, our brain is acclimatizing and becoming hypervigilant. And of course, as voices are throwing information at us, it's engaging our processor. And of course, you've seen that I've represented that before in this way, so that actually this is just Bayes' theorem of perception, that we receive a stimulus in a context which sets our expectation of it. That new piece of information coming in that context gets a reaction, and that's a physical reaction, an emotional, which we feel as an emotion. And of course, we then process that information by adding and deleting pieces of evidence to reach an outcome, of course, that we're trying to achieve. And of course, the experience of it is this flow of information, and of course, and the emotions that result from that. And of course, I represent the unusual stimuli of hearing voices by the Jack in the Box. And of course, the key thing about it, regardless of our experience of it, is the sort of top of the hierarchy of our experience of it is that it is different. We experience it as something different, as something unusual, and that's because it presents in the aware mind, independent of the context that we're in. So of course, I hear voices, well, anywhere really. And of course, it's pretty clear that the stimuli are not coming from my environment. So that's what I mean, is that, the stimuli actually self-select. It's got nothing to do with what I'm doing. It bypasses all of our filters, so, ordinarily, the brain would actually select items from what's around us based on the context we're in or what we were expecting. We will actually notice particular things and actually ignore other things. So our brain is literally self-selecting. Yes, our brain is self-selecting. Our brain is selecting stimuli from our environment. What's different about voices is that voices are selecting, and that's what I mean. The phenomenon self-selects, bypassing our filters, and by doing that, it presents a context which is typically either in conflict with or in competition with the context that I am currently in. So it introduces, the effect is that it introduces some kind of conflict or competition of stimuli. So especially if I'm receiving those stimuli with a kind of higher signal strength, because they're unusual, then you can kind of see how they're competing, of course, with everyday stimuli. And of course, the effect of this is that what we do is, as we think about it and analyze it, we create a new frame of reference for it once we've actually got a label for it. So I first, in the first episode videos, you'll see, when I first started to hear voices, what I heard was the sound of two people talking about what I was doing at home. So the context in which I interpreted it was I was home alone. I shouldn't have been hearing people. Of course, once I went to the doctor and he described it as auditory hallucinations, that was when I created a new frame of reference. And I had this thing called auditory hallucinations that then gave me, a completely different sort of frame of reference for it, which usually has some form of socio-cultural relevance in the beliefs that our cultures have, or in our social environments have formed about these things. So, if I was living in a tribe in Africa, that context would have been one thing. So having been to a doctor in New York, that context, of course, was a different one. But nevertheless, what the brain is doing, or the mind rather is doing, is creating this new frame of reference. And then, of course, what happens is, as we continue to be exposed to voices, each little transaction is something that our brain recognizes and updates. Our brain is looking for patterns. So what we're doing actually is that our brain is actually populating this new frame of reference based on voice behavior. And this is an important thing. I have no control over voices, over when they arrive, over what they say. It's experienced very much as something, as I say, that is external. As you've seen from this stuff, I mean, it's pretty highly unlikely that my brain can produce this kind of stuff. So what's happening is this frame of reference is being populated by voice behavior. And I say that because actually what that does is, because we lack evidence, we kind of tend to respond to this emotionally. And those emotions are what we project forwards in our processing. So the beliefs that we form are likely to be based on small amounts of evidence that voices have presented, but clouded, if you like, by my emotional response to it. So if voices are aggressive, and I experience it as scary, of course, then the kinds of beliefs that I will derive about it will have that scary flavor. So the first piece that happens, as I say, from exposure to this thing is that we become aware of it. And over time, so we create this frame of reference, which we then update regularly based on the behavior of voices. And of course, what happens is that interaction over time develops a pattern. And of course, the questions that we're, so that we get this pattern based on where and when this happens, that sort of becomes our prediction of timing. So of course, yes, I call this presence, which I say you want to think of as timing. And as you'll see in other videos, presence has this sort of mix of being there and not being there, absence. And then, of course, that leads then to us, of course, anticipating it. So we're trying to identify a pattern which will enable us to anticipate it, so that we can create the right kind of expectations, or at the very least minimize, of course, our reaction to it. We try to be prepared for it. It's pretty straightforward stuff. So, of course, this presence, which I say is sort of all factors that are related to timing. So presence, absence, where, when, frequency, all of those things create a pattern, say, which is generally something that is unpredictable when you're hearing voices. And of course, what that does is it fosters perceptions of uncertainty. So, unpredictability here flows through this sort of process as uncertainty. So we're assessing implications in a mindset of risk or of uncertainty. So of course, what happens because of that, the brain starts to acknowledge it as significant, because we don't know what it is, we don't know what the implications are. We start to account for it, and of course, our brain learns to do that. It learns to keep sort of searching that sort of space. That this frame of reference, where this frame of reference is located in the brain. And of course, what happens is that the mind then starts to anticipate it. And what that means is that the stimuli that then arrive, we're evaluating them based on some sort of cognitive bias instead of a good context, or as data. We're simply, we've developed cognitive biases based on our emotions, and of course that's the framework that sets our expectation. And of course, if we believe, if the behavior of voices is aggressive, we'll form beliefs about this thing being malign. And of course, what will then, our cognitive bias will start to reinforce that. So that's the effect of this presence and timing, is it actually shapes how the mind anticipates and sets expectations. And of course, that then is the signals we pick up are framed by our cognitive bias. So the process then by which we're recognizing these signals is biased based on so primarily voice behavior, which making our brain adjust in that way. Another factor then about the phenomenology itself is its invasiveness. So for me, this is something about the aggression of voices, not just in terms of what they say and their language and their bullying, but literally this is for me almost something of sort of closeness. That's what I mean by invasiveness. For me, at times, voices are quiet. So right now I have this little tingle, almost a bit like tinnitus. I'm aware of it, but I easily ignore it. Sometimes I will hear voices talking, and I am actually able to not respond. I mean, I've noticed it, so I haven't quite ignored it, but I can certainly, not take account of it in my response or of my outcomes. There are other times, of course, when they come much closer, what the effect is that I'm getting a much, much stronger reaction. And of course, the stronger the reaction, the more likely my brain is to process it, to account for it and process it. And of course, if voices manage to throw something at me, that engages my threat system, and of course, and if they do that by preparing beforehand, so talking about a theme for a while. So for example, voices gave me a very hard time about sleep for a very long time. So on the earlier slide, I spoke about voices creating this thing about fairies, and this major noise around the head when I'm in bed, of course, keeping me awake. Of course, what happened, is then that, the next day when I went to bed, of course, voices played the same game, and the next day the same game, and the next day the same game. So of course, every time I'm going to bed, I'm now anticipating this thing, and it was so invasive. Of course, I said that this noise is quite a din, and of course, what that's doing is it's far more likely to engage your processor. And I had to work very, very hard to actually just lie there and say, okay, do your thing. I just recognize that this is going to take 2 hours just out of my night, and I have two choices. I can lie here and and sit it out, or I can get up and go and watch TV and then do it all over again after I watched TV for an hour or two and go back to bed, because that was kind of the nature of the voices. So in the end, I decided, okay, the best I could do was just lie there and say, get on with it. When you're finished, I will eventually fall asleep. I tried taking sleeping tablets, but they were not actually strong enough to counteract the invasiveness of this phenomenology. So this invasiveness is this closeness, this power with which it engages the brain. At a distance, I'm aware but can ignore. It comes closer, engages my processor, I might be able to interrupt it. And there are other times, I say, especially if it engages your fear system, that actually interrupting it feels impossible. And of course, what happens is you tend to freeze, and then voices can throw a lot more at you. So I would actually talk about those sort of three degrees. I say aware but can ignore, can interrupt, and kind of feel like I'm, completely under the spell of, might be the three sort of degrees. But of course, what's happening with this is that, of course, our processing is distorted because this information is actually inserted. I'm certainly experiencing it, at the very least, as unpleasant, possibly scary. And even if it's unpleasant, it kind of easily makes you angry. Because all of those things are doing is that they're actually generating false signals. And by false, I mean they actually have nothing to do with your environment or what's really going on in your world. And of course, what happens, of course, is that your processing is distorted, and if voices just kind of keep persisting. As I say, there are some things that you just, in the end, learn. You have to just wait it out. And voices persisted with this theories thing with me, for example, for weeks, and then introduced just other ideas to disturb my sleep. I probably had a year of playing games, with sleep, and in the end decided that the best thing I could do was just pick a routine and ignore voices. And if I slept, I slept. If I didn't sleep, well, tough. I'd get up in the morning and and get on with my day. But of course, what's happening with all of this is, of course, your brain is responding to it if your mind is engaged, and it's rewiring the brain. And of course, what's happening is you're creating new paths and new relationships between different frames of reference in your mind. So when I say new paths, for example, as I said, it took me a while to decide, to just lie in bed and let this stuff pass, if you could put it that way. Not that that was easy, but there was a very long time where I actually just, I got up and I would read, I would go and watch TV. I would listen to music. I would listen to music in bed as a way to try and distract from it. I say, in the end, I realized that actually the best I could do was actually try and is just dismiss all of those sort of displacement behaviors, for want of another description, because they didn't work. Even taking sleeping pills didn't work. And that all I could do was actually, as I say, just endure it for as long as it took voices to get bored with that particular theme and pick another one. But of course, what's happening there is it's very, very easy to get into a new pattern. That when voices pester you, you get up and go and watch TV. And then, of course, if you've got that new pattern, voices then have you disrupting your sleep instead of them disrupting your sleep. So that's what I mean by the mind actually being rewired. You literally develop a new pattern, a new program that becomes a habit. And of course, you don't even realize that's happened. You now get used to the idea and accept the idea, that voices disturb my sleep, and actually, so what? I'll get up and go and watch TV. We're actually, you might be better off enduring it for a few more months before voices get bored with it. So then the other thing about this is that voices are able to introduce all this variety. So independent of the sort of theater and stories that I mentioned on the previous page, here I'm talking about things that are small changes that get your attention. So these are things like distance, direction, a voice behaving out of character, clarity, mumbling, which makes you listen more attentively. So a whole bunch of things like that of course, seem to be designed to get your attention and sort of hold your attention. Of course, what that does, though, is once you've got your attention, what follows is the piece of information that comes into focus. So it's a way to bring particular information into focus. And of course, the most common thing a voice is doing this is calling you by name. So my voices call me Greggy Boy. And of course, you habitually respond to your name if you hear it. And it becomes that easy. You so quickly develop a pattern that when voices call you by name, you're actually listening, listening to what they're saying, or certainly paying attention to what they're saying, or at the very least noticing what they're saying. And of course, those are just different degrees of your power to accept or reject. So listening, if you like, is accepting and sort of paying attention to, and noticing might be something you can say, okay, heard it, now go away. But of course, that's what's happening. It's getting your attention, bringing stuff into focus. And of course, what that does is that the brain literally recognizes the input. So, and of course, the input produces signals, recognition signals. It's doing something down here about populating this sort of frame of reference of voices. And of course, I'm forced to choose, make a choice about it. And of course, I find that actually with voices is that you have to proactively reject them because they keep persisting. So if they keep persisting, of course, you have to work harder to dismiss that information. So I choose simply to reject it, because that for me, of course, is by far the easiest way to do it. And of course, what that does, it makes my real life much relevant, as in the same way that it is for everybody else. And of course, makes voices less relevant. But of course, what the mind is also doing here is, of course, forming a picture, of this behavior. It's quite often, as it relates to particular voices. So when I'm saying, sort of distance, direction, clarity, mumbling, saying something out of character, or continuing to say something, persisting in character when that character isn't very exciting. And so what we're doing is we're creating character and personality. And of course, the effect of that is that we read that as intent. So I have one voice, Poopsie, in particular, that annoys me. And the reason she annoys me is that she says these stupid things that are completely irrelevant. And of course, she managed to sort of get a program going, if you like, where literally all she had to do was say, Greggy boy. And of course, that's enough to distract me from what I'm doing. It's this thing, it's got my attention, distracting me from something else that I'm doing. And of course, that irritates me. And I say, at least once a week, I'll blow my top and go outside and yell at Poopsie, and then come back inside and get on with it. It's just a way to vent the irritation and prevent it from bubbling over into other things. So I just sort of choose when to do it, and I choose a place to do it that makes it irrelevant. But of course, what that's doing is it's just getting my attention, which at the very least is a distraction. So even though I'm dismissing it, it's still a distraction from what I'm doing. And then, of course, the other piece of it is the stuff that we've seen on the previous page, is that this, voices then impose these stories on us. So they engaged me in this philosophical debate about religion for 10 years. They engaged me in the idea that because of my ideas about religion and about voices, that I'm engaged, of course, in some kind of conspiracy theory. And of course, all they're doing is, with those two stories, they're moving the frame of evidence from otherworldly religion hereafter to, and then conspiracy is this world stuff. So the corroborating evidence, if you like, that I'm getting to kind of assess the evidence they're throwing at me is coming from different sources. But of course, what's really happening here is that voices are working their relationship here, because every piece of information that they sort of throw at you is a little interaction that updates the sort of patterns. It's this populating, again, are based on voice behavior. And by inserting that behavior into a story, the story is what gives it a higher level of significance. And the higher the level of significance, the more likely the brain, of course, is to retain it and program it in. So, of course, this is what's happening. Of course, the brain is sort of updating our patterns, not just of voices, but of our real life, because this stuff actually has real implications in my life, even if they're nothing like what voices claim they are. The real problem is this, that it's updating, it's wiring my brain, it's contaminating the information in my brain, it's changing paths of association, of logic, of inference, of interpretation, of assessment of implications, of assessment of risk, of assessment of opportunity, of assessment of priority, all of these kinds of things. And of course, that's the big problem from the mind point of view, is this thing comes along, presents a piece of information that's sort of out of context, I'm forced to choose. And of course, what's happening in effect is that my priorities are being distorted. So when voices are, for example, encouraging me, and I'm able to get manic, that train of thought holds more weight and significance emotionally than it does, than it holds in terms of relevance in my story. And I actually have to proactively work to say, gosh, this feels good, but it does nothing for growing my story. And it's, it's that shift from one to the other that you've got to learn to actually manage. So what the stories are doing is establishing levels of significance, relevance, and urgency. So these are the themes that are, that I think, that actually that the brain, if you like, is responding to, in a way. These two down here, the sort of awareness and the presence, which is awareness and then where and when, those together are what are the things that are shaping my expectation, which leads me, of course, to anticipate. This degree of emotiveness is strongest acting in terms of the emotion that it provokes. So the strength and the power with which it engages me is the strength of my emotional reaction to it. And of course, our emotional reactions are involuntary. So the information and the way that is presented to me invasively engages my emotion. And of course, that's kickstarting my response process. So it starts my response. And because of that, it actually pushes my assessment of outcomes towards, of course, a particular direction. And then, of course, what's happening is in that process, as I've been pushed, by this emotional reaction, of course, voices are inserting new evidence that's still getting my attention. Whereas I might be trying to dismiss this, of course, voices are continuing this path of throwing more stuff at me. And what they're doing is they're inserting new evidence. By getting my attention, bringing specifics into focus, they're inserting evidence in my assessment of everything. And of course, that then, of course, translates to my story. But most fundamentally, what it's doing is it's changing the choices I make. It's actually changing the choices available and changing the choices that I make. It changes the choices that I can even see and conceive of. And of course, it introduces new ones that are there for me and not for you, simply because I have this whole bunch of nonsense going on. And of course, those choices are sort of in both ways. So if I'm manic, for example, getting this emotional stimulation that might be pushing me in a direction, I went down lots of dead ends, kind of doing stuff that seemed like a good idea at the time, and then eventually the logic fell apart. In terms of trying to understand these voices, for example, it was quite easy in that sort of space. When I'm studying this voice behavior and the phenomenology and trying to make sense of it, I'm experiencing all that confusion you saw in the earlier slide. It was very easy for voices to lead me down the garden path to sort of dead ends. So I expended a lot of effort, certainly a lot of thinking effort, around stuff that kind of went nowhere. And that's primarily because voices engaged me so powerfully emotionally. I experienced this. I found the experience so vile. And then I translate that and say there's 300 million other people who aren't understanding this thing. Of course, that then was very, very powerful sort of motivator. And of course, what that was doing was completely changing the choices that I was making, completely changing my priorities. I prioritize this stuff over my own financial well-being, for example, pretty significantly. And it's just an unfortunate sort of outcome of this thing. But I say it's changing choices, it's changing the choices available, changing the choices that we see. It's also creating choices, of course, in which we limit ourselves. So that's the significance of all of this. So these are the themes that come from asking the question is, why can't I ignore it? It's because once I'm aware of it, I have a frame of reference that then voices are in control of when and where they present. Those two set my expectations. Voices are in control of how invasive they can be. It's this, I call it sort of hit and run. They sort of, come at me, they create this kind of scenario, they up the tempo, they come closer, and of course that is a much, much more powerful way of sort of engaging my processor. They're interfering with the evidence that I have available to kind of influence this flow and assess outcomes and implications. And the result of that is limiting my choice. So I'm calling those, say, awareness, presence, invasiveness, variety, and then content. So how do those themes come together from a slightly different point of view? So over time, of course, the brain is adjusting to those things. So this is literally the brain adjusting. So stuff that's happening in an involuntary way, and in fact, in a way that we are quite often not aware of unless it's pointed out to us. Of course, if it's pointed out to us, we might recognize it. Of course, the most important of these is actually hypervigilance. Is that because this thing is unpredictable, it exhibits such variety, has exerted significance in terms of its interaction, and in terms of the relationship, and in terms of the beliefs I've formed about it, and is engaging me with stories that interfere with my stories, and of course is provoking all these questions. So all of those themes come together in hypervigilance, where my brain, as opposed to mind, my brain has adjusted to focus more specifically on the inputs that voices throw at us. And of course, those inputs are bits of information that of course affect my view of the world. But most important is that, from a processing point of view, is I fast forward those to assessing implications. And of course, that's what creates the extreme states. So if I've got, this sort of full-on combination of a belief that this voice is malign, that it has influence, and then voices come along and create a scene, up the tempo, engage me invasively, throw something at me that seems threatening, my brain is fast forwarding that to assess implications. And of course, that's, is what leads to panic and paranoia. So the stimulus that comes along with all that sort of confusion, let's say that we can simplify based on the previous slide, kind of in this way. So these things, this is the thing that makes me aware of it. So then the presence, invasiveness, variety, prepare my mind to receive content. And all of those things actually are voice behavior. They're nothing to do with me or my brain. The effect on my brain is that my brain has become hypervigilant. So my expectation is I don't know what's coming. I should be ready for it, basically. And of course, what that's doing is it's bringing whatever voices throw at me into focus, which of course is the best way to contaminate my processing and of course my automatic updating of information in the mind. The content then arrives by a number of different modes. I spoke about 4 on the earlier slide, where I went from just auditory, verbal, making it personal, and thought echo. So what I want to do here is actually just take 3 of those. Really, I'm just combining the first 2 as one in effect. So I'm talking about them as one-way outbound. So what I'm meaning is one way is the flow of information is kind of one way, but the implications are outbound. They're not really for me. And this is where, you might, for example, be hearing sort of snippets, what I would call sensory snippets, hearing a sound, seeing something a little unusual, and I say perhaps, perhaps voices. And I'll talk more about these in how they influence the mind in another way. But the key thing here is to say that this is kind of a one-way interaction with this phenomenon, and my assessment of implications is outbound. It's somewhere else. It's not really, it doesn't have much of an implication for me. I'm seeing this as part of something else. The second would be, the kind of what I'm calling now one-way inbound. So this is what we might call auditory verbal hallucinations would be an example of this, where voices are talking about me as a person, about what I'm doing. So the implications are for me. I'm assessing the implications in my story, in my life. So for me, so that's what I mean by the implications are now very much inbound. It's much, much more personal. And I'm hearing voices, and I'm more likely to attach. I'm hearing people or voices talking to each other, and I'm more likely to attach personalities to us because voices belong to people or sentient entities. And of course, I'm going to attach some kind of personality to it, which becomes a belief about what this thing is. And then, of course, the other one is the thought echo, as I've described it, where now both what voices say and my thoughts are here audibly in the same space. I say the effect of that is that my thoughts have consequences, because every thought is now registering, processing signals, in the same way that my having a conversation with someone with whom I'm in a very close, intimate, and in this case, abusive relationship that I can't escape from. So that's what's happening here now. My thoughts have consequences. Literally every thought has consequences, and every thought I have is something that voices are interfering with by inserting evidence in the way that I've described on the earlier slide. So you can imagine, of course, that these, as you move from here down to this one, the reaction that it's producing, of course, is much, much more powerful. Simply, this is a phenomenology style, if you like, that is emphasizing that aspect of invasiveness earlier on, where of course this one is experienced much more invasively than this one. And I talk about these three in another video called psychotic, and profit. I use these three same ideas, but you can see that video for more of that. But of course, what's happening here is that I'm, from an evidence point of view, because what's happening, of course, this is pushing me in a direction to seek evidence, whilst I try and figure out what I'm trying to do with it. And of course, the general theme of evidence over here is that these are just snippets that are sensory, that I'm experiencing in an unusual way. I'm, somehow collecting bits of information that are sort of out of context, but they're not engaging me aggressively enough that I'm assuming that they have relevance. So I'm actually able to decide whether or not they are relevant. In that sense, I assimilate them as I would any other sort of data or information. Of course, what's different is they're presented in the aware mind in an unusual way, but nevertheless, I feel like I have choice from there of being able to include it in my interpretations or not. So recognize that I've already lost a choice. It's mere arrival in my aware mind is that it's information that is presented in an unusual way that I'm more likely to give significance to. And I didn't realize I've lost that choice because I think I can dismiss it, or assimilate it by choice. But I said the choice I've lost, is whether to even encounter it. Okay, so recognize that piece. Over here, where I'm hearing two people talking about, what I'm doing, for example, I'm able to interpret that in some way because the evidence I have is two people talking about what I'm doing. So, for example, in my first episode videos, I translated that when I first heard it as my upstairs neighbors. And once I've been to the doctor and he described it as auditory hallucinations, I found that gave me an interpretation. And of course, I then went to assessing the implications of that for me, what that meant for my mind and what I could do, for example. But this has the evidence seeking has an interpretive flavor. It's presented as relevant because it's talking about me. So I'm interpreting that, in some kind of way. Whereas down here, so my voices sort of claim to be God and the devil and all these other things. So now voices are actually asserting. So those don't have a neat one-for-one match, but in the same way that this is more invasive, of course, this is more invasive. Over here, I feel like I have a choice. Down here, it's presenting as relevant, so my processor is engaged. Down here, voices are asserting it, and the only way I can avoid processing it is to completely reject it. Because voices have made an assertion in a space, and my brain is fast forwarding that. And so I have to actually work to negate that, to stop it, to block it, to anticipate it, to prevent it. And of course, you'll see that's what I do, of course, in the mind tools. And then, of course, as I'm fast forwarding that, I said there are all these other things that are sort of style type issues that relate to other qualities that sort of that this information comes wrapped in. And I say this is what I'm calling body language. These sort of style things. So this is aggression, tempo, clarity, distance. All of which are signals, if you like, that we read as intent. And of course, what we sense as intent of these voices, has a strong influence, of course, on how we assess implications. So if a voice has claimed to be the devil, my brain has got that thought there. So unless I'm very proactively rejecting it, that's what's engaged the brain. That's what's produced the reaction. And then, of course, so this thing is being assertive and persistent with it, and is then using aggressive language and threatening me. Of course, those are the implications that this thing pushes us towards. And of course, that's what you need to recognize with this thing, is that because the mind is predictive and the brain adjusts to that predictiveness, as a way to kind of set our expectations, then hypervigilance and sort of this stuff bringing information into focus, very much leads our implications in a sort of fast mode, for my description, which is the experience of it. And of course, what's happening over here is that information gains relevance both emotionally and from the point of view of a brain response. So hypervigilance is increasing the signal strength with which I recognize a piece of information. And it sort of also sort of comes with a sort of electric potential that it arrives and says, okay, where are you going to send me? I mean, that's sort of what's happening. It's as if you're not even getting to ask the question, well, do I even want to? You know, that's, you know, if you're looking at this piece of data, it's really assumed it's going somewhere into your applications. And then, of course, what's happening here is as we process it, you know, as we figure out a response, this sort of evidence towards interpretation and therefore assessment of implications is in effect led by voices. We don't even realize it's happening because we think we're in control of it because we're seeing our half of the response. But what we're not registering at the time is, of course, is that what we're responding to is what voices have said. So voices have set the context, voices have set the agenda, voices have inserted this priority into your mind. And of course, whilst, you know, I might still, as I say, you know, in fact, I very proactively help people own their reaction and their response so they can minimize the implications of this, you know, and it gives you this sense of control and confidence. Great stuff. But even in spite of that, what's happening is, of course, that voices have in effect set the topic. By throwing a piece of information at you, your brain is reacting to it and calling up a particular frame of reference, which is why you'll see in the Mind Strategies videos that what you want to do is actually interrupt the process and focus on the outcomes that you want in the real world. And of course, what that does is it actually negates this whole thing or process by which voices assert relevance and engage a frame of reference. So that's the significance of all of this thing. This is why literally the brain can't ignore it. And what's happening over here is the brain can't ignore it. It's always over here, even, you know, recognizing it because it's unusual. And over here, we have to flat out reject it. You know, so you know, that's what I mean by, you know, it can't be ignored or it won't be ignored. You know, so even actually I found, I say, when you reject these things, you know, so I reject what voices claim in terms of who they are, what they are, in terms of the influence in my life, and in terms of the outcomes and things that will happen in my life and around me. Even though I flat out rejected, of course, voices persist. You know, with these kinds of ideas, and even though, of course, you know, what they claim doesn't come true, it doesn't stop them from continuing, of course, to persist. Which is why, as I say, what happens is, you know, you just you learn, as I say, to interrupt it, to anticipate it, to disrupt it, and make that a habit in the mind, so it actually becomes less effort to dismiss it as opposed to ignore it. So key thing then to learn from here is, you know, is to recognize that actually, you know, the brain is what is giving this thing mind share, because the brain is acclimatizing, is becoming hypervigilant, and that is causing us to recognize the information that voices throw at us, you know, in a different way. It's putting it into our focus and creating a climate in which we're giving it attention. So that's why we actually have to work quite hard, as I say, to reject it, or at least recognize that rejecting it is an option. And number two, of course, I'm hoping that this is showing you why rejecting it is by far, of course, the best option, because, you know, the more of it that you sort of let go through and the more of it you accept, the more it is actually contaminating your information and, of course, wiring the brain, because your brain is being wired as you respond. So you could, yeah, of course, so that's at the very least changing your priorities. So for me, as I say, you know, even with voices encouraging me and saying I love you, what that's doing is distorting my priorities. I put a lot of manic effort into some things that I should never have bothered with because they were irrelevant, of course, in my story. So just summarizing that, you know, stories are important because we get caught up in them, because that's how we experience life, basically. So we experience life as a story, you know, which is just this whole bunch of sequential actions and events that over time, you know, come to define me, the stuff I expose myself to, the stuff I act on, the stuff I choose not to act on, you know, all of those sort of choices that I'm making, you know, or what come to define me in time, which is why on the earlier slide, you know, the impact on our choice, of course, is so important. The other is, of course, that we experience relationships as story. So, you know, because I say I've heard these voices now for 10 years, 3 of them claiming to have front row seats. I have very specific relationships with these 3 voices. I find all of them abusive. I couldn't care less, for them. They're uninvited, unpleasant, in fact, downright miserable. But of course, what's happening is each time they throw something at me, you know, the interactions move our story along. And of course, in time, although I've managed to reject them, of course, I still have little emotional fluctuations. So as I say, you know, once a week with Poopsie, you know, I will actually just get frustrated and walk outside, shout at her and come back inside and get on as if nothing had happened. You know, whilst that's, you know, a less than 2-minute exercise once a week, the mere fact that I have to do that still irritates me, see. But I say, this thing is a relationship that's forced on you, and we experience that as a story. So of course we get engaged in it. So as I'm telling you about, you know, about Poopsie, I'm telling you about her behavior and my response to it, whereas actually what I should be telling you is that what's happening with Poopsie is that she is provoking my monitoring system to get me irritated, because if I get irritated, that will lead to anger, and then from that I will actually do something irrational or stupid, or something that I might regret, you know, or it might lead to, say, an outburst in a public space. Now, I've recognized all of those things, and I say the way that I manage it is to kind of say, okay, once a week I might get I might let that irritation boil over, and I do it deliberately in a space that's within my control. And of course, then the other thing is, of course, is that our experiences are stories. Our experiences themselves are stories. So even little pieces, you know, of our we experience life as a story. Of course, that's just a collection of smaller, shorter experiences. But the thing about those is that the experiences in the mind, so not just what we think and how that translates to what we do, is a progression of reward signals. And of course, voices are distorting each of those. And we're going to recognize is that particularly if you have a thought echo, then thinking signals, the signals from thinking are the equivalent of signals from acting and interacting with people. And of course, that's the sort of transactional progression of reward. You know, that is our value chain, our perception of a value chain. Of course, that's what voices are, of course, distorting. And then, as I'm saying, the brain actually adjusts to all of this in time. So we become hypervigilant, which distorts the signal strength that is attached to each piece of information that we're arriving, not just from voices, but of course, if voices have managed to make me scared of my environment, or make me believe that someone in my environment, you know, is actually threatening in some way, you know, even just by telling me what that person is thinking or will do or whatever, they're changing my perception of my relationship with that person. You know, all of those signals are recording false signal strengths. They have false qualities attached to them. They are, each signal, each piece of information is invoking a context, it's presenting a context, you know, which is not of my actual choosing. And of course, that produces a reaction which pushes my processor pushes forward. If that reaction is an unpleasant emotion, then that unpleasant emotion will define or the boundaries of the interpretations that I reach and the implications that I assess as a result of. So this thing is actually provoking our train of thought in a particular direction. And of course, what this is doing is it's introducing competing ideas that compete with my ordinary story from a significance point of view, a relevance point of view, a priority point of view, and an urgency point of view. So of course, that's why I say it's actually important that we recognize that this jack-in-the-box can be rejected. And I hope that actually what you're seeing from this is that in fact we should be rejecting it. And of course, in my mind strategies, I show you ways to do this, as I say, because voices actually do persist. So the point is that because this thing is transactional, it's happening, you know, at the level of thought. So every thought I have is now interfered with by voices. That clearly is changing everything in my life. It's changing how I see everything. It's changing my perceptions. And of course, what I've got to keep doing is actually, as I say, rejecting voices and bringing my attention and focus back to my everyday world, and compensate for that by doing that mindfully and exaggerating my everyday signals until that becomes a habit and actually displaces voices. And you'll see that that's what happens, of course, in the mind strategy section. So you've seen this before. Of course, what we can do, as I say, is reject these inputs completely. And of course, that's an important way to think about it. If instead of thinking about them as voices, we simply think about them as stimuli coming from an unknown origin, then it's much easier to accept the idea that actually these are just stimuli, and I have absolute choice over which ones I'm going to accept and reject. And when you see this complexity and how devious it is in terms of how it undermines of how the brain adjusts to it to give it greater significance in our lives, then what we could do is act at the significance level to make it irrelevant. And so you do that by rejecting it. So thanks for listening to this video. I'd like to keep as much of this possible and much of this as possible free for people who hear voices. To do that, I have this fundraiser on crowdrise.com called Someone You Know Hears Voices. If you can contribute, I would appreciate that. If you'd like to comment on social media, please use hashtag #MadeSense. And if you're a researcher or a group of service delivery professionals and would like to work together, please reach me on my email here, greg@made-sense.com. And once again, as with all the other videos, there are plenty of other players in the space, all operating off donations who would appreciate help as well. So thank you for listening.